Hey there, glad you're here tonight. Before we begin, take a second to dim the lights, settle into something cozy, and maybe adjust your pillow just a bit. If you have a small fan humming, or a candle flickering in the corner, even better. This is your time. The day's done and nothing needs your attention except the rhythm of a slow, sleepy story drifting from another time. We're going to talk about something not often mentioned in history books. Not battles, not kings, not castles or plagues or revolts. No, tonight's story is all about medieval junk food. Yes, really. The sweet, greasy, occasionally chewy, sometimes frightening, yet always fascinating snacks that everyday people reach for when life got too gray. Think of it as comfort food from a time when comfort was in short supply. And as always, if you enjoy this kind of storytelling, feel free to like the video or leave a comment down below. I'd love to know where in the world you're listening from and what time it is for you right now. Are you unwinding after a long day or curling up before sunrise? Either way, thank you for being part of this sleepy little community. Now close your eyes. Let's drift backward to a time when sugar was rare, apples were dangerous, and fried dough could lift your spirits just enough to get through another medieval day. You don't hear the sizzle first. You smell a thick hot air wafting from the stone hearth, carrying the sweet sharp scent of apples and warm lard. It cuts through the smoke of damp firewood and the tang of unwashed linen. You're not sure what's cooking yet, but your mouth begins to water anyway. Welcome to the medieval kitchen, or more likely the back corner of a street stall tucked into a crooked alley behind the town square. A place where health codes are centuries away and temptation smells like fruit and fire. What you're smelling is an apple fritter. Not exactly the glossy frosting-laced donut you might grab at a coffee shop today. No rainbow sprinkles here. No powdered sugar dusted on top. But still a medieval fritter was a treat. Made from thin slices of apple, or when apples weren't available, something pretending to be an apple dredged in batter and dropped into boiling fat. They emerged blistered and golden, sometimes dusted with a pinch of spice if you were lucky or well-connected, and eaten piping hot. The batter itself was rustic, a mix of flour ale or wine, and maybe an egg if the hens had been generous that morning. They were sticky, they were dangerous, and they were beloved. The medieval version of fast food was rarely fast, and even more rarely safe. There's a certain thrill in biting into something hot from the fryer when you're not entirely sure what oil it was cooked in, or how many times that oil has been used. But people did it anyway, because apple fritters tasted like hope. Hope that maybe tonight would be a little sweeter than yesterday. Hope that even in a world full of damp straw beds and unpaid taxes and suspicious puddles, there was still room for pleasure. Historical records like the 14th century cookbook, the form of quirky compiled by the master cooks of King Richard II, describe fritters quite plainly. Take good apples and slice them. Fry them in batter with good fat and serve with sugar. That's about it. No exact measurements. No temperature guides. No instructions about washing your hands. Just apples, batter, fire. One mainstream historical fact often cited by culinary historians, like Terence Scully and Peter Breers, is that deep frying was surprisingly common in medieval kitchens, especially for festival food. Fritters weren't everyday fare, but they did appear at fairs markets and special occasions, particularly during pre-Lenten feasts, when people binged on rich foods before the fasting season. The fat used varied lard if you were poor sweat, if you were slightly better off, and oil precious, and imported if you lived near a monastery or in southern Europe. And here's the quirky bit. Not all apple fritters actually contained apples. In lean years, cooks made mock fritters with parsnips, or turnips soaked in honeyed wine and passed off as fruit. Some even used thick slices of bread dipped in cider fried and sweetened with a bit of dried fig paste, apple adjacent enough to fool the weary and the hungry. Now was it safe to eat? Not always. The oil was often reused until it became dark and thick, sometimes flecked with bits of batter from last week's lunch. And considering most cooking happened over open fires, there was always the risk of a surprise flame or a scorched eyebrow. Burns were common, especially among female cooks, whose work near hearths was unprotected by aprons or gloves. You reached in, you flipped the fritter, and you hoped your sleeve didn't catch. Historians still argue whether fritters were truly considered luxury or simply a clever way to disguise bad ingredients. Some say they were indulgent and reserved for holidays. Others argue they were just a smart method of masking the quality or age of the apples and using up stale beer in the batter. But regardless of their origins, fritters became symbolic of something larger, fleeting joy in an uncertain world. Because food in medieval times wasn't just about nourishment, it was about contrast. Most days you ate barley porridge or boiled cabbage. On good days, someone handed you a hot, sticky puck of fried fruit and let you taste sweetness even for a moment. Imagine holding one now. It's warm in your hand, almost too hot to touch, and the steam curls from its ridged surface. The batter crackles slightly as you bite in. The apple, or what you hope is apple, is soft and tart inside its edges, caramelized by the fat. There's a whisper of spice, maybe cinnamon, maybe pepper, depending on what was available or who was selling. And for the first time all day, maybe all week, your mouth feels something other than hunger. It feels content. Of course, if you were a noble, your apple fritter came with flair. It might have been glazed with a reduction of spiced wine, or studded with currants. Sometimes cooks used rosewater or saffron luxuries that transformed a simple snack into a display of status. These were served not in paper wraps, but on pewter plates, often as part of long feasting courses between meat dishes. But for most people, the fritter was humble, fried in a shared pan, passed hand to hand, eaten before it cooled. In bustling towns like York or Bruges, you might find fritter sellers near the church steps on festival days. No menus, no prices posted. Just the smell guiding you in and a greasy cloth wrapped around something golden. One friar in 13th century Paris reportedly complained about the noise of sellers of apples and fritters. Beneath the monastery windows, a delicious example of how food and faith collided often literally in daily life. And yet these simple treats have endured in spirit. The act of deep-frying fruit in batter is timeless. Across the world, from India's jalebi to Japan's tempura, from carnival zeppole to fairground funnel cake, people have taken something sweet or bland, dipped it in dough, and tossed it into hot fat. Because sometimes we don't want nourishment. We want warmth, crunch, mess. We want to taste something golden, even if it burns our tongue. And as you curl deeper into your blankets tonight, maybe you can smell that ancient sweetness. Maybe in your mind the hiss of oil meets the flicker of firelight. Someone in the distance laughs. A bell rings from a nearby chapel, and you, in the middle of a cobbled street with stars overhead and rough wool around your shoulders, take another bite of something that shouldn't exist, but thankfully does. It starts with a faint squeak, tiny, sharp, barely audible unless you're really paying attention. Not the sound of a rat or a wagon wheel, but the sound your teeth make as they press into a bite of medieval cheese curds. It's an odd sensation, that slightly rubbery resistance paired with a subtle give, and even odder when paired with the realization that what you're chewing isn't melting, stretching, or oozing anything at all. It just sits there, passive, proudly unimpressive. And yet, for reasons even you can't quite explain, you go back for another bite. Welcome to the wonderfully underwhelming world of medieval cheese curds. If the apple fritter was the sugar rush of the Middle Ages, cheese curds were its popcorn. Not flashy, not fancy, but strangely comforting in their blandness. You didn't eat them because they dazzled you, ate them because they were there, and because your mouth needed something to do between sips of warm beer and sighs of cold weather. Cheese curds were the accidental product of milk on the move. Fresh milk was notoriously difficult to preserve, in a time without refrigeration, and curdling was inevitable. But rather than toss it out, medieval cooks leaned into the process, coaxing out the curds, pressing them and serving them as they were soft, squeaky, and sometimes salty, depending on the mood of the cow and the temperature of the cellar. They weren't aged. They weren't refined. They were young, raw, and unapologetically plain. Historical references to simple, fresh cheeses appear throughout medieval records. In the Domesday Book, for instance, compiled in 1086 under William the Conqueror, many manors were assessed based in part on the dairy products they could produce. Cheese was an economic staple, not a delicacy, and curds were among the most common forms. The 13th century Ancrène-Visse, a guide for anchoresses female religious recluses, even recommended curds as a modest food suitable for pious living, easy to digest, humble in nature, and unlikely to inspire gluttony or vanity. But here's the thing, curds weren't boring to everyone. In some regions, especially in Northern Europe, curds were deliberately flavored with herbs, wild garlic, or even nettles. Think of it like a medieval cheese board with none of the glamour and all of the texture. Curds might be eaten alone, mixed into porridge, or rolled into small balls and dried for storage. In some monasteries, curds were served alongside honey as a sweet, savory treat, particularly on feast days when heavier dishes were avoided. It wasn't luxurious, but it was special. One particularly quirky practice from medieval England involved squeaking cheese, a nickname for fresh curds, that would make a soft noise when bitten into. This wasn't considered a flaw. In fact, it was something of a quality marker, a sign that the cheese was fresh, unaged, and still lively. Children reportedly found it amusing, and more than one traveling monk wrote of their surprise at the mischievous delight of young novitiates pressing curds against their teeth to hear them squeak like small mice. But not all curds were charming. There were regional disputes over how they should be made and served. Some believed curds should be drained thoroughly and salted. Others insisted on leaving them a bit wetter, almost spoonable. In parts of France, curds were pressed into wooden molds, dusted with ash, and aged into soft cheeses like Saint-Marcellin or Reblochon, though by that point they ceased to be curds and graduated into something grander. Historians still argue whether curds were a practical necessity or a cultural preference. Were they simply a way to stretch the shelf life of milk? Or did people genuinely enjoy their peculiar texture and neutral taste? The answer may lie somewhere in between. Like many medieval foods, cheese curds were adaptable. They were what you made of them. And if you added a little honey or tossed them in some herbs, or paired them with bread soaked in spiced wine, you might even convince yourself they were a delicacy. Imagine sitting now in a wooden tavern, smoky and dim, the rushes underfoot curling at the edges from damp boots. A woman with calloused hands slides a small bowl toward you. Rough pottery chipped at the rim, filled with pale yellow nuggets that wobble slightly as you poke them. You pick one up. It's cool to the touch, slightly greasy. You bite. It squeaks. It doesn't dissolve, doesn't gush. It just holds its ground. And oddly, that feels comforting, because not every snack has to amaze you. Some just have to exist. To be there in the pause between harder meals, reminding you that food doesn't always need a purpose, beyond occupying your jaw, and giving your tongue something to think about. In moments of festivity, curds were sometimes fried, yes, even before mozzarella sticks were a thing. Recipes in medieval German cookbooks, such as the 14th century Ein Buch von guter Speise, describe frying curds in batter until golden and puffed. The result was crisp on the outside, tender, and chewy within. Seasoned with herbs or sprinkled with coarse salt, these fritter curds likely served as street snacks during markets or carnivals. And let's not forget curd cakes. Not quite cheesecake, not quite pie. These were rustic mixtures of curds, flour, eggs, and sometimes dried fruit, baked into hearty rounds meant to last. Served warm, they were passable. Served cold, They resembled something between a medieval doorstop and an undercooked omelette. But they filled bellies, and that was enough. There's something oddly poetic about the role of curds in medieval life. They weren't special, but they were steady. Like a friend who doesn't have much to say but always shows up. In a world where meat was scarce, sugar was rare, and freshness was fleeting, curds offered a small form of predictability. You knew what you were getting, and you knew it would do the job. Close your eyes for a moment. Picture that bowl of curds beside a mug of ale, a crust of blackened bread, a wedge of apple that's seen better days. Outside, the wind whips through stone alleyways carrying the smell of rain and chimney soot. But inside, you're warm. Your fingers are sticky with cheese and your belly feels just a little fuller. The tavern hums with low conversation and the clink of pewter. No one's in a rush. Not even the curds. Let's say you're standing in a smoky kitchen, sometime around the 13th century. There's flour on the floor, smoke curling into your eyes, and a faint smell of something burning, but not badly. It's the kind of burn that might mean flavor. You've been handed a slice of something that looks like pie. And in a sense it is. Sort of. The crust is sturdy, not flaky. The filling not fruit, not meat, but mashed turnips. You take a bite. It's warm, vaguely sweet, and vaguely not. There's a texture you didn't expect, soft, fibrous, but thick like a memory of mashed potatoes, pretending to be pudding. There's a hint of honey, a trace of spice if someone in the kitchen was feeling generous, and the solid, honest taste of a root vegetable that survived winter better than most people did. Welcome to the humble, often misunderstood world of turnip pie, a dish that tried against all odds to pass itself off as dessert. Turnips in the medieval world were everywhere. They were cheap, they grew well in cold, rocky soils, and they could be stored in root cellars for long stretches of the year. While carrots, parsnips, and even onions made their way into soups and stews, the turnip was a staple, dependable, durable, and utterly unexciting. So, of course, someone eventually decided to turn it into a pie. The logic wasn't entirely flawed. Medieval cuisine, after all, was built on adaptability. When apples were too expensive or out of season, cooks reached for other produce. When sugar wasn't available, which was most of the time for ordinary people, honey-dried fruit and wine were used to sweeten dishes. And so the turnip pie emerged, boiled or roasted turnips mashed and mixed with ingredients like breadcrumbs, eggs, bits of dried fig or currant, maybe a dash of saffron if you had access to the rarest goods, then baked into a thick crust made of flour and water. No butter, no sugar glaze, just ambition and root vegetables pretending they were more than they were. A well-known medieval cookbook, Le Viandier, attributed to Guillaume Tirel, also known as Taillevant, includes references to pies made from root vegetables, including turnips. While the exact recipes vary, the basic structure was the same. Create a filling from whatever you could gather. Mash it to uniformity spice, it to conceal the monotony, and encase it in pastry to give it dignity. Turnips weren't the stars of medieval kitchens. They were more like character actors with a reliable role. And yes, there were times when turnip pies could actually be pleasant. Honey, for example, was often used to sweeten the mash. The inclusion of warming spices like cinnamon, nutmeg, or even clove luxuries imported along trade routes added complexity. Dried fruits provided small bursts of flavor, while the pastry shell absorbed everything into one warm, cohesive bite. It wasn't elegant, and it certainly wasn't refined, but it did what food was supposed to do: feed you, fill you, and if you were lucky, surprise you. But not everyone was fooled. There's a popular medieval anecdote mentioned in several later collections of rustic folk humor about a nobleman biting into a pie and demanding to know who had made dessert from horse feed. The cook, apparently unfazed, replied that what feeds a beast can also soften a man. True or not, it captures the conflicted place of the turnip in culinary history. Necessary, familiar, and always trying to prove itself. Here's your mainstream historical fact. Turnips were one of the most commonly cultivated crops in medieval Europe, particularly in the British Isles and northern France. They were often planted as a secondary crop in fall, harvested in early winter, and used extensively as both food and livestock feed. According to agrarian records like those compiled in The Husbandry by Walter of Henley-C, 1270 turnips were valued not only for their longevity in storage, but also for their versatility. They were boiled, mashed, roasted, added to stews, or as we've seen, hidden inside pies. And here's a quirkier tidbit. Turnips were also associated with protection and warding off evil. In some parts of rural England, carved turnips were left at doorways or fields to deter spirits, much like the later tradition of jack-o'-lanterns. Some even believed that eating turnips during certain feasts helped ensure fertility or good fortune for the household. So the next time you eat a turnip pie, you might be partaking in a faint echo of medieval magical thinking, or maybe just someone's failed dessert experiment. Hard to say. Historians still argue whether these kinds of pies were considered savory or sweet in intent. The line between the two in medieval cuisine was often blurred. Many dishes were sweetened with honey or spiced without being strictly desserts. A meat pie could be heavily perfumed with cloves and cinnamon, while a fruit tart might be grounded with herbs and vinegar. So where does a turnip pie land? Some scholars suggest it was a clever in-between, neither truly sweet nor entirely savory, just filling. You picture yourself holding a slice now warm in your hand. The crust is rough but sturdy, baked hard to survive both the oven fire and the journey from hearth to table. The filling has cooled just enough not to burn your tongue. You bite. It's not terrible, not delightful, but not bad. There's something familiar in the way the mashed root clings to the roof of your mouth. Something oddly cozy in the hint of honey that arrives late on your tongue. You chew slowly. The fire crackles nearby. Someone else in the room is trying to decide if they like what they've been handed. A child makes a face and eats it anyway. And in that moment, turnip pie does its job not as a treat, not even as a trick, but as a quiet survival tactic, wrapped in dough. In fancier homes, turnip pies were upgraded. Cooks might mix in ground almonds, or use almond milk as a base to create a creamier texture. Spices were more elaborate, the crust more tender, even decorated. A few even shaped pies into animals or floral patterns, art you could eat though you might still be chewing turnip. At royal feasts, pies were showpieces, the exteriors gilded or stamped. The fillings sometimes replaced entirely with more exotic ingredients, but still labeled turnip as a modest joke. But for peasants, the turnip pie was honest. No frills, no garnishes, just warmth. A slice big enough to share or maybe to trade. A dish that made use of what was left. A moment of quiet sitting on a stool made from a log with wind howling outside and the pie steaming gently in your hands. It was the kind of food that didn't have a recipe so much as a memory. A grandmother's way of doing things. A neighbor's suggestion. A pinch of this, a splash of that. A guess based on smell and color and feel. No one measured. They tasted. They hoped. And somehow it worked. Tonight, as you drift, you might imagine that slice in front of you. It's not perfect, but it's warm. And in this moment, like so many before it across centuries, that might be just enough. It doesn't start with the scent of butter or flaky crust, because in the medieval world, pie wasn't exactly a luxury. It wasn't dessert. It wasn't even considered all that celebratory most of the time. It was survival, often cleverly disguised. And what better disguise for things better left unnamed than a tightly sealed, thick-walled pastry crust? What better culinary sleight of hand than a meat pie? You sit at a trestle table in the corner of a cold hall. It's drafty, as most halls are, and someone is arguing about a missing chicken. Your dinner arrives round brown and hot. The top crust is sealed like a lid puffed slightly in the middle from steam. There's no smell giving anything away, no hint of what's inside. Which is exactly the point. In medieval kitchens, the meat pie was many things: efficient, portable, long-lasting. But above all, it was deceptive. If something had legs, wings, fins, or even a pulse a few days ago, chances are someone had already tried putting it in a pie. It was a game of culinary hide-and-seek. Rabbit, maybe. Pigeon, possibly. Eel, sometimes. Hedgehog. Well, if you didn't ask, they wouldn't tell. Meat pies were democratic in the worst and best sense of the word. Everyone ate them, from farmhands to feasting nobles, though the ingredients and execution varied wildly. For peasants, the crust was thick and hard, more like a container than a component. Known as a coffin or coffin in medieval English, it was made from flour and water, baked to be tough, and used as a kind of edible lunchbox. Sometimes it was eaten, sometimes not. Sometimes it was saved to feed the dogs or to sop up the last of the broth days later. Either way, it was functional. The filling was where things got interesting or alarming. Meat, sure, but not always the kind you'd expect. Whatever was available, left over or beginning to age out of safety, might find its way inside chopped small, seasoned heavily, and sealed away before it could protest. Spices were essential not only for flavor, but for camouflage. Pepper masked smell. Sage softened sour notes. Clove and garlic provided a kind of sensory misdirection. If it tasted good, no one asked further questions. In wealthier kitchens, pies were an art form. The crusts were finer sometimes, enriched with lard or egg. The fillings were carefully layered, minced capon and pork dates, and currants, saffron, and mace. The dishes were served hot and perfumed with spices imported from the East. At banquets, pies might contain surprises: live birds, sculpted figures, or symbolic designs baked into the top. They were entertainment, as much as nourishment, a spectacle of status theater you could eat. And here's your mainstream historical fact. In 15th century England, meat pies were central to noble cuisine. Cookbooks like the Form of Cury, compiled by King Richard II's master cooks, include dozens of pie recipes, featuring game meats, spices, and elaborate preparation. These recipes emphasize the complexity of flavor, the importance of spice, and the way pastry could elevate humble ingredients into something festive. The crust in these cases was no longer just a shell, it was a statement. But elsewhere, the meat pie stayed simple. In small-town bakeries, pies were sold from wooden stalls or carried in baskets lined with cloth. Travelers could tuck one into a satchel and eat it cold days later. Markets bustled with sellers hawking hot meat, wrapped in paper or cloth. These pies didn't have names. They had shapes: rounds, ovals, some with markings scratched into the top to signal what lay inside, though accuracy wasn't guaranteed. A quirky bit of pie lore comes from France, where regional pies known as tourtes could sometimes include sweetened meat fillings. Recipes from the 14th century Le Ménagier de Paris, a household manual written by an aging husband for his young wife, describe pies of veal and dates lamb with prunes and pork, mixed with apple. The lines between savory and sweet blurred, and even more so when fruits were used to conceal the origins of less desirable meats. A pie that smelled of cinnamon and clove could easily hide the fact that its contents had once been more feathered than fresh. Historians still argue whether pie fillings were primarily driven by flavor or necessity. Was the heavy spicing a cultural preference, or a desperate measure to hide spoilage? Some suggest it was both a reflection of limited refrigeration and a taste profile shaped by trade. Medieval Europeans had acquired a love for bold, warming spices, not only for their real or imagined medicinal properties, but because they transformed otherwise grim ingredients into something memorable. You hold the pie now in both hands. It's heavier than you expected. Warm. There's no fork, no plate, just the crunch of crust beneath your thumb as you break it open. A puff of steam escapes, rich and peppery. Inside you see chunks meat, sure, but also something darker, stickier, maybe a preserved fig or a strip of dried plum. You take a bite. The filling is dense, seasoned, and strangely satisfying. There's something sweet in the middle, something chewy. You chew slowly, thankful that whatever it is tastes like food. Maybe that's all anyone ever wanted from a pie in the Middle Ages. Not answers, not elegance. Just something warm and complicated enough to distract you from asking too many questions. It was food with a past, literally. It came from somewhere and someone, and possibly some time ago. In some regions, pies took on symbolic meaning. During Lent, they were made with fish and greens instead of meat. During weddings, they were decorated with initials or family crests. During harvest festivals, they were stuffed with whatever the fields had offered rabbit, barley, leek, chestnuts. Even the church occasionally got involved. There were rules written and unwritten about what could be eaten, when, and how. Some monks documented pie fillings in great detail, not for culinary reasons, but as part of monastery records on agriculture and self-sufficiency. In a small way, every pie told a story of scarcity, of creativity, of risk sometimes. There's a kind of honesty to that. The honesty of eating something wrapped in crust and not knowing exactly what it was. A quiet surrender to flavor over facts. Now imagine that pie sitting in your lap, wrapped in coarse linen. The night is cool. A torch flickers near the gate. Someone is humming a drinking song 2 buildings over. You bite again. A flake of crust sticks to your lip. It tastes like pepper and thyme and something else you can't name, but it doesn't matter. For a moment you're full. For a moment the questions fade. That's the power of a meat pie, to carry you through the hard bits, one bite at a time. You're chewing, but it's more like cautiously cracking something between your molars and praying your teeth survive the experience. This isn't dessert. This isn't bread. It isn't even what you might optimistically call candy. This is a fennel seed coated in sugar as hard as a pebble and believed to be good for your digestion, or your breath, or maybe your courage. Honestly, you're not sure anymore. All you know is someone handed it to you after dinner, smiled gently and walked away. Now your jaw hurts. Welcome to the unexpected world of medieval candied fennel seeds, the original post-meal gamble. In a time before toothbrushes, breath mints, or even the faintest notion of oral hygiene, these tiny candy-coated seeds were the closest thing medieval people had to Tic Tacs. If Tic Tacs came with the risk of dental trauma, you'd often find them brought out after heavy meals, especially on feast days or in wealthier households. They were believed to settle the stomach, freshen the mouth, and restore balance to the body. That last part might sound oddly mystical, but it reflects a very real feature of medieval health theory, humoral medicine. According to this system, based on the teachings of Galen and Hippocrates, every food had qualities hot or cold, dry or moist. After a rich, heavy meal filled with meat and bread, both considered warming and drying, it was essential to rebalance your system with something cooling and moistening. Enter fennel. Mainstream historical sources confirm that fennel seeds were a staple of medieval herbal medicine. In fact, the Tarquinum Sanitatis, a widely circulated 14th century Latin medical handbook based on Arabic sources, praises fennel for its ability to expel windy's digestion and refresh the breath. Physicians recommended fennel for treating indigestion, bloating, and bad breath long before Listerine became a thing. But raw fennel seeds weren't always pleasant to chew, and sugar was a rare and expensive commodity. So in moments of indulgence or clever kitchen experimentation, they were coated in sugar syrup, left to harden, and served in tiny portions. These little candies became especially popular in noble households, monasteries, and at weddings or religious feasts where they might be handed out at the end of a long, gluttonous meal. And that brings us to the hard truth. These things were rock solid. Unlike modern candy, which melts or shatters softly in the mouth, candied fennel seeds in the Middle Ages were dense. Sugar was boiled down until brittle, often reboiled to stretch its use, and then poured over the seeds in thick, uneven layers. The result was a confection that could be as dangerous as it was medicinal. Some were cautious, sucking gently until the sugar softened. Others, usually younger and overconfident, bit down too quickly and regretted it. Dental care being what it was, rudimentary at best, you didn't want to crack a molar over something that small. One contemporary account comes from the 15th century court of Burgundy, where detailed banquet records mention dragées, small sugar-coated spices or seeds served after meals. These were status symbols both because of the expense of sugar and the effort required to make them. Cooks had to carefully boil syrup coat each seed or spice and allow them to dry without sticking. No candy thermometers, no non-stick surfaces, just time patience and a lot of sugar. A curious side note, dragées weren't always fennel. They could be made from coriander, anise, caraway, or even small nuts. Some were even gold-leafed for added flair. But fennel was the most common, partly due to its medicinal reputation, and partly because it actually did help with post-meal discomfort. Plus, it left your breath smelling like licorice, which was an upgrade from the usual medieval aroma of onions ale and regret. Historians still debate the primary function of dragées. Were they truly medicinal, or mostly ornamental? Some argue they were a status-laced afterthought like mint chocolates at a fancy hotel. Others emphasize their therapeutic role, noting that many medical texts list sugared herbs as part of digestive treatment regimens. Most agree it was likely both a small luxury that made people feel better, whether by placebo or genuine relief. Now imagine someone handing you a small cloth pouch tied with twine. You open it to find a handful of tiny irregular beads, hard glossy and faintly fragrant. You pick one up, hold it between your teeth, and test it with a soft bite. It holds. You try again gently this time and hear a faint snap. Sweetness spreads across your tongue, followed by that unmistakable licorice taste. You chew slowly, careful not to shatter anything that can't be regrown. The pouch disappears into your sleeve. These candies are too precious to waste, too risky to rush. You suck one down, feel the sugar dissolve grain by grain, and let the sharp, cool flavor cut through the heaviness of bread stew and cheese, still clinging to your palate. You feel almost refreshed. In some homes, candied fennel was prepared at home. In others, it was purchased from apothecaries who doubled as candy makers. These shops, often run by monks or merchants with connections to spice traders, carried everything from medicinal syrups to sugared ginger candied orange peel and preserved rose petals. Confections were part of the larger world of health flavor and trade, and they traveled along the same routes as silk pepper and amber. Occasionally, candied fennel seeds were even offered in churches or monastic guest houses to visitors. A small kindness, a sweet gesture, a way of saying we value your presence, just not enough to give you the big cakes. Speaking of which, dragées were also a common component in spice plates served at the end of upper-class feasts. These trays offered a curated mix of comfits, preserved fruits, sugared nuts, and of course candied fennel. They were meant to aid digestion, delight the senses, and close the meal on a fragrant note. Imagine it as the medieval version of a breath mint platter, one that could cost more than your monthly rent. Back in your imaginary kitchen, someone offers you another piece. You hesitate. Your jaw still aches, but you take it anyway. It's sticky this time, the sugar hasn't hardened properly. You bite in cautiously, feeling the syrup stretch before it snaps, and once again that sharp licorice note dances across your mouth. Outside, night has fallen. Somewhere down the alley a pig squeals. The candle on the table flickers low. You hold the last seed in your palm, rolling it between your fingers, grateful for something small and sweet, in a world that was rarely either. And when you finally tuck it away for later, maybe to chew on while you walk home, you realize you've just experienced the medieval version of dessert dental risk and all. The cake doesn't bounce. It doesn't jiggle or flake. When you pick it up, it holds its shape like a brick and weighs nearly as much. It sticks to your fingers with the stubborn glue of honey long cooked. And once you bite in carefully, it doesn't so much crumble as yield, slowly, reluctantly, and with an unmistakable density that makes your jaw work harder than you thought a dessert ever could. This is not a sponge cake. This is not something you'd serve with tea and polite conversation. This is a medieval honey cake, and it is here to test your resolve. But once you chew through the initial resistance, once you make it past the chewiness and the clinging, cloying sweetness, something happens. You feel a warmth, a weight, a deep, earthy satisfaction that doesn't come from refined flour or elegant technique. It comes from something older, rougher, more honest. A cake made not for celebration, but for survival. Honey cakes were one of the oldest and most enduring sweets in the medieval world. Long before sugar became widely accessible in Europe, honey was the main sweetener for almost everything: desserts, sauces, drinks, and even preserved meats. It was revered not just for its sweetness, but for its medicinal and symbolic properties. Monasteries kept bees. Royalty received honey as tribute. And across every class of medieval society, honey was one of the few reliable ways to turn simple ingredients into something that tasted almost luxurious. The basic honey cake varied by region, but its core remained the same: flour honey, and maybe eggs, nuts, or dried fruits if the pantry or the harvest was kind. The batter was thick and heavy, baked slowly over a fire or in stone ovens that lacked precision but made up for it with heat and patience. The end result, a dense, sticky cake that could last for days, sometimes weeks, and grow more flavorful with time. In Jewish communities across medieval Europe, a form of honey cake known as lekach was served during holidays, symbolizing a sweet year to come. In monastic records, cakes flavored with honey and herbs were sometimes distributed to pilgrims or made for saint days. And in marketplaces, particularly during winter festivals, thick wedges of honey cake were sold wrapped in cloth or paper, portable, durable, and capable of satisfying a sweet tooth long before sugar plums or gingerbread made their appearance. And here's your mainstream historical fact: honey cakes appear repeatedly in medieval culinary manuscripts, including the 14th century English cookbook Forme of Curie and the German Einbuch von guter Speise. While specific instructions were vague by today's standards, often calling for a goodly amount of honey, or enough flour to make it stand the presence of honey cakes in multiple regions and cultures, underscores their importance. They were a consistent part of feast days and religious observances, and even used medicinally to coat bitter herbs, or make tonics more palatable. But not all honey cakes were created equal. In wealthier kitchens, they might be studded with dried figs or dates spiced with imported cinnamon or ginger, and baked in shaped molds to resemble animals or flowers. These were more than food, they were edible displays. Some were even gilded with edible gold leaf, or drizzled with syrup for extra gloss. In contrast, the common folk's honey cake was a rough, squat loaf. No decorations, no frills, just substance. Some even added ground barley or oats to stretch the flour and make it heartier. The result was a cake that could double as trail food lunch or breakfast the next day, eaten cold hard and with a mug of ale, or a smear of thick goat cheese. A quirky practice emerged in some parts of medieval Germany and Austria, leaving honey cakes to age for a week or more before eating. Bakers believed the cake developed deeper flavor over time and softened slightly with storage. In reality, this may have just been an excuse to spread out the labor and get through the busy festival season. But the result was a cake that could survive long-travel shipboard journeys or harsh winters. Historians still argue whether honey cakes were primarily festive or functional. Were they symbols of wealth and community celebration, or just dense calories wrapped in sweetness? The answer, like the cake itself, is likely layered. In noble households, they accompanied elaborate meals and marked seasonal rites. In poor ones, they stood alone as the only sweetness of the month. Either way, they remained a culinary mainstay. Now imagine holding one. It's been sliced from a larger loaf, and its surface is slightly glossy, tacky with residue. You pick it up, and your fingers stick to it lightly at first, then stubbornly. You take a bite. The crust resists. The inside is dense and chewy like dried fruit mashed into bread. The sweetness isn't sharp or bright. It's dark, toasty, complex. You chew and keep chewing. Outside, the air is cold. A distant bell chimes. Inside, the fire is low and the cake is warm in your hand. Someone offers you a mug of weak wine, and for a moment, everything else taxes chores. Hunger fear dulls to a low background hum. You're just sitting, eating something rich and satisfying. Something that reminds you in its weight and quiet stubbornness that you're still here. In some feast records, honey cakes were given as gifts to travelers, especially during religious festivals, or on the eve of long pilgrimages. They were believed to bring strength and endurance, and in a few Christian legends, honey was associated with divine favor. After all, in the Old Testament, the Promised Land flowed with milk and honey. To eat honey was to taste abundance, however modest. Later in the Renaissance, these cakes would evolve. Spices became more available. Sugar gradually replaced honey in wealthier homes. Cakes became lighter, fluffier, more decorative. But the original honey cake never disappeared entirely. It stayed in the background, unchanged, waiting. So tonight as you lie, still picture one of those old cakes in front of you, dense, glazed with time, pressed into your palm like a memory. You tear off a piece. It sticks to your thumb. It fights your teeth. But it comforts your soul. And long after the sweetness fades, the warmth remains. The first thing you notice is the sogginess, a kind of medieval melancholy clinging to the crust, as if the bread itself has given up. It's limp damp and only vaguely holding its shape as it slumps in your wooden bowl, soaking in something dark and sour-sweet. This isn't a dish born from abundance or celebration. It's a dish born from necessity, from frugality, from the very real need to not waste yesterday's bread. This is trench toast or something like it. Bread wine or ale and the quiet hope that warmth might make the past edible again. Today we might call it a rustic cousin to French toast, but that would be giving it far too much glamour. There are no eggs here, no cinnamon, no sugar or milk. Just stale bread, often hard enough to knock on softened in spiced wine, warmed gently and eaten with a spoon. It was sometimes known as SSOP soups or trenches, depending on the region, and it was about as far from decadence as you could get, while still technically making a comfort food. Let's start with the basics. Bread was the cornerstone of the medieval diet. Everyone ate it, peasants, nobles, clergy, children. And because bread was made in large rounds or loaves, it was common for it to go stale before it could be finished. Refrigeration didn't exist. Preservatives were unheard of. And good flour was expensive, so wasting bread unthinkable. The solution was simple: soak it. Soak it in broth, in wine, in milk if you had it. Soak it until it surrendered its stiffness and could be chewed again. Add a pinch of spice, clove, pepper, cinnamon if available, and maybe a splash of honey. Warm it over the hearth, serve it in a bowl, and pretend it was intentional. Here's your mainstream historical fact. Soaking bread in liquid was not only common, but a formal part of dining in many households. The practice of using SOPs dates back to at least the 12th century, and is frequently mentioned in accounts of both aristocratic and monastic meals. The term SOP originally referred to a piece of bread dipped in liquid wine broth or milk, and was often used as a vessel for eating soft foods or sauces. According to medieval food historian Maggie Blacksops were the medieval spoon, especially before utensils became widespread in lower classes. Nobles, too, embraced the SOP, but dressed it up with finer ingredients. The bread might be soaked in spiced hippocras, a sweetened wine layered with dried fruit, or topped with slivers of almond or a shaving of hard cheese. In more elaborate feasts, sops were carved from specially baked trenchers, thick slabs of bread that doubled as edible plates, and soaked in sauces from meat dishes, then eaten by the guest, or given to servants or dogs after the meal. But for the common folk, trench toast wasn't a side dish, it was the whole meal. The bread could be days old, often baked with coarse grains, or bran dark and heavy. The wine or ale used for soaking wasn't the good stuff. It was often sour, spiced with herbs to mask its age, or boiled briefly to soften its acidity. A bit of butter or fat might be added if available, but more often than not it was just bread wine and wishful thinking. A curious fringe tidbit in some religious communities, soaked bread became a symbolic food. In certain monastic traditions, especially among Cistercians and Benedictines, soft sops were eaten during periods of penance or mourning. The idea was that the dish, simple and softened, represented humility and detachment from worldly pleasures. You weren't supposed to enjoy it. You were supposed to accept it. Historians still argue about the cultural status of trench toast. Was it considered a shame food, a last resort? Or was it genuinely embraced as comfort? Some culinary scholars believe that the act of softening bread in warm liquid had an emotional element, especially during winter. Others point to the way soaked bread appears in both noble and peasant menus, as evidence of its versatility. As one chronicler put it, none are above a sop when it is well made. Now picture it. You're seated on a low stool beside a hearth. The air smells of smoke and wet wool. Your bowl is carved wood, hand-worn and warm to the touch. Inside, 3 slices of dark bread float in a reddish broth that once was wine and now might be vinegar. You lean down, spoon in hand, and break the soggy surface. Steam rises. The scent of cloves surprises you. Not bad, not great, but warm. The first bite is soft, almost too soft. It reminds you of porridge, but with structure. The bread collapses in your mouth, the flavor sharper than expected. Tangy, earthy, a whisper of dried thyme, or maybe it's just the flavor of the bowl itself. Either way, you chew slowly, letting the warmth spread. You're not alone. Across Europe, others are doing the same, eating similar sops in different languages in bowls. In Italy, peasants make panada bread boiled in broth. In France, they call it pain perdu, or lost bread. In Germany, it becomes Brotsuppe, often mixed with egg or onion. And across the centuries, the concept persists. If bread is old, don't waste it. Soften it. Spice it. Eat. In times of hardship, war, famine, or harsh winter's trench toast became not just a dish, but a tactic, a way to turn the stale into the sustaining. And because it didn't require chewing like hard crust did, it was often fed to the elderly or the ill. In fact, many medieval medical texts recommend warm sops for those recovering from illness or childbirth, particularly when digestion was fragile. Of course, there were upgrades. Wealthier households sometimes added meat drippings or bone broth. In some festive versions, sops were served as the first course known as soup doré, or golden soup, made from enriched bread soaked in egg yolk and saffron, then lightly fried. But at its heart, trench toast was always about transformation, about making something old edible again. And maybe that's why it endured. Because trench toast wasn't flashy. It wasn't made to impress. It was made to comfort, to stretch, to remind the eater that while yesterday's bread may be stale, it's still bread and still enough. So tonight, as your body sinks deeper into stillness, picture that bowl. Picture the way the crust softens at the edges, the way the spoon dips in without resistance, the way the warmth creeps up your chest as you swallow. It's not joy exactly, but it's relief. And sometimes that's more than enough. You hear it before you see it. A quiet crunch, a polite struggle. Someone near the hearth is trying to chew lips pressed tightly, eyes slightly squinted. Not from pain exactly, but from concentration. They're eating a dried fig, or a date, or a piece of what was once a grape, but now more closely resembles a pebble. Whatever it is, it's clinging to their back molars like a barnacle, and there's no going back now. Welcome to the sticky, seed-filled, dentally challenging world of dried fruit in the Middle Ages, a humble indulgence that was as annoying as it was adored. At first glance, it might seem like a luxury, After all, dried fruits like raisins, dates, and figs were sweet, portable, and long-lasting qualities that made them invaluable in a world where fresh produce was seasonal, fleeting, and often scarce. They were traded, hoarded, gifted, and served at banquets. But for all their reputation, dried fruits came with caveats, chief among them texture. These weren't the soft, chewy, perfectly plump fruits you might find in modern trail mix. They were dense, chewy, sometimes crunchy in all the wrong places. Left to dry in the sun or preserved in low-tech kilns, these fruits toughened with time. Their sugars crystallized, their skins thickened. Their seeds, many of which remained intact, doubled as nature's floss and occasional choking hazards. Still, they were beloved. The use of dried fruit in medieval cooking was widespread and well documented. One mainstream historical fact in the 14th century cookbook, The Form of Cury. There are more than a dozen recipes that call for raisins or currants, often as sweeteners, thickeners, or flavor enhancers. Dried fruit was a key ingredient in both sweet and savory dishes, from pies and puddings to stews and sauces. The combination of meat and fruit, though odd by modern standards, was completely normal in the medieval palate. In fact, one popular dish, blancmange, a kind of rice pudding often made with almond milk, and shredded chicken, frequently featured raisins or dates for added sweetness and complexity. Another mominy was a spiced meat stew, thickened with bread and sweetened with dried fruit and honey. In these dishes, raisins weren't the star, they were the depth, the little nod of richness. Dried fruits were also medicine. In apothecaries, dates were recommended for sore throats, raisins for digestion, and figs for moistening the chest, whatever that meant. Figs, in particular, were often prescribed to soften the bowels, a charming euphemism for medieval constipation cures. Physicians like Hildegard of Bingen praised dried fruit as part of a balanced, spiritually attuned diet, though she did warn against overindulgence in anything too sweet. For the wealthy, dried fruit arrived by ship dates from North Africa, figs from the eastern Mediterranean, and currants from Greece or the Levant. These were stored in tightly sealed boxes, lined with waxed cloth or packed in straw. They weren't cheap and they weren't always fresh, but they were a mark of status, and offering them at a meal, especially alongside cheese or wine, signaled both wealth and hospitality. Among peasants and townsfolk, however, dried fruit took on a different role. While imported goods were rare, local varieties of dried apple, plum, pear, and grape could be made at home. Households near orchards would slice fruit, thin, lay it on wooden racks, and let it dry slowly over several days. These would be stored in cloth sacks and added sparingly to porridge bread or honey cakes. A child who found a raisin in their breakfast. That was a good morning. Now picture it. A simple bowl of porridge gray and steaming with 3 raisins, sitting like tiny black jewels on top. You spoon one up. It resists a little hardened slightly with age. You chew. The sweetness emerges slowly mixed with oat and ash from the hearth. Not spectacular, but memorable. A fringe anecdote in some households, particularly during winter, or Lenten fasts, dried fruit became a sort of prize. Children were sometimes rewarded with a fig for good behavior, or given a single date on a holy day. The scarcity made them sacred. The chewiness made them last. Historians still debate whether dried fruit was eaten more for flavor or function. Some argue it was a necessary preservation method, just another way to avoid spoilage. Others highlight its symbolic weight sweetness in a bitter world. Raisins and figs show up in religious texts, feast menus, and even medieval poetry, where their clinging, stubborn texture is occasionally used as metaphor for love or longing. And the seeds, oh, the seeds! They get stuck. You know they do. In every gap between your teeth, in the soft pocket behind your molars. You roll your tongue around to dig them out, but they cling like secrets. And sometimes they remind you of where the fruit came from hot, sun-dry wind distance. Tonight you hold a dried fig in your palm. It's small, wrinkled, sticky with its own syrup. You bite in. The skin pulls slightly. The seeds crack under pressure. There's an unexpected burst of sweetness, deep, almost floral. Then the chew. It takes time. You have to focus. You feel the sugar and the grit. You taste effort. And somehow you're grateful for it. In noble houses, fruit might be soaked before serving, softened in wine perfumed with rosewater, or glazed with honey. But even then it clung to its origins. Dried fruit was never just sweet. It was work, time, labor condensed into a bite. And maybe that's why it meant so much. Because it didn't melt. It didn't vanish. It stayed, stuck between your teeth, wedged in your thoughts, lingering like a memory, just like tonight. It's greasy. That's the first thing you notice. Not unpleasantly so, just enough to catch the light as it cools in your fingers. The crust is golden and crackled, the shape irregular, like someone scooped it together in a hurry and tossed it into a pan with more hope than precision. You raise it to your lips, inhale the warm scent of meat, salt, and spice, and something else, something faintly metallic. This isn't dinner. This is a snack. And not just any snack, but one of the most beloved, misunderstood, and unapologetically strange offerings of medieval street food, the blood pudding ball. And if that wasn't strange enough, let's follow it with a slippery fried coil of eel, crispy on the outside, tender on the inside, and depending on how it was seasoned, oddly reminiscent of chicken, if chicken were born in a river and harbored a mild identity crisis. Yes, we've arrived at the true edge of medieval snack culture. The bold, the bizarre, the bites you grabbed from a market stall on your way to the fair, or before a long night watch. These were the snacks that didn't just feed you, they dared you. Let's start with the blood pudding ball, a compact orb made from animal blood, usually pig thickened with oats or barley, seasoned with onion pepper and herbs, then shaped and fried in lard until firm and dark. Think of it as the medieval energy bar, high in iron, dense with calories and easy to carry. No wrapper needed, no expiration date in sight. Here's your mainstream historical fact. Blood-based dishes were common across medieval Europe, especially in northern regions where every part of an animal was used. The famous black pudding of England, the boudin noir of France, and blutwurst in Germanic lands all trace their roots to early recipes that combined blood with grain. According to food historian Ken Albala, blood sausage and its fried cousins were not only practical, but celebratory, often made during slaughter season, when meat and offal were briefly abundant. These weren't delicacies. They were everyday essentials, cheap filling and easy to prepare in bulk. Markets and fairs often featured vendors selling blood pudding slices or fried balls wrapped in cloth or leaves. For workers and travelers, they were perfect. One or two could replace an entire meal, keeping hunger at bay through labor or cold nights. But despite their practicality, blood snacks came with baggage. The texture was divisive, soft inside, almost creamy when hot, but with a thick outer crust that could crunch or crumble, depending on how long it had been in the pan. The flavor was deep, earthy, faintly iron-rich, comforting to some, repulsive to others. You didn't casually nibble a blood ball. You committed to it. Now, if blood pudding was the reliable companion of northern markets, fried eel was the culinary daredevil of the waterways. Eel, once a common protein throughout medieval Europe, especially in England and the Low Countries, was abundant in rivers, streams, and marshlands. It could be trapped with relative ease, preserved by smoking or drying and sold in large coils, or chopped into chunks for the fry pan. A fringe historical tidbit. In parts of medieval England, particularly near the Thames, eels were so valuable that they were used as currency. Monasteries recorded rents and tithes paid in eels thousands at a time. A 13th century record from Ely Cathedral noted one tenant owing 60,000 eels annually. That's not a typo. Eels were business, and while many were smoked or boiled, fried eel became a favorite snack for travelers near the coast or near fish markets. The process was simple skin the eel no small feat, as the skin was notoriously slippery and had to be pulled off like a wet sock. Then chop dredge in flour or crushed herbs and fry in hot fat until the edges curled and browned. The result, a strangely appealing bite, crunchy outside, flaky within with a flavor, somewhere between oily fish and rustic poultry. Not elegant, but undeniably satisfying, best eaten with fingers straight from a basket, lined with rough paper or cloth, and ideally chased with warm ale. Historians still argue about the social perception of snacks like these. Were blood bowls and fried eel seen as humble fare tied to the working class? Or were they viewed with a mix of admiration and suspicion for their boldness? Some food scholars point out that these snacks appear in tavern menus and feast inventories alike, suggesting they cross social boundaries, particularly in festive or public settings. Others argue they were tied more closely to regional availability than status popular, where animals were slaughtered often, or where rivers ran thick with eels. Now close your eyes and picture it. You're at a village fair. The square is loud with shouting music and the clatter of hooves. Someone nearby is juggling. Children chase each other with carved turnips on sticks. You approach a vendor, a woman in a linen apron standing behind a sizzling pan. She hands you a cloth bundle. Inside, 2 blood pudding balls and a slice of fried eel, still hot, still hissing slightly from the oil. You bite into the first ball. The crust gives way crisp and savory, revealing the warm, spiced filling inside. It's rich, shockingly rich. A little goes a long way. You chew, surprised by how much you like it. The second bite confirms it, weird but good. Then the eel. It's flaky, pulling apart with a soft tug. The skin where it remains is charred and crispy. The taste is full fishy without being harsh, warmed by pepper and whatever herbs the vendor had on hand. It sticks to your fingers. It makes your breath linger. And you finish it anyway. Because in the medieval world, snacks like this weren't guilty pleasures, they were necessary ones. They fueled you, pushed you forward, reminded you that even the oddest ingredients could become something worthwhile if seasoned right and cooked with care. By the time you wipe your hands on the cloth, the fare is starting to fade. Lamps are lit. Music softens. Somewhere a bell chimes vespers. You feel full, not just in your stomach, but in your bones, as if the day has given you just enough to keep going. And sometimes all it takes is a little courage and a fried eel to get you through. You've just finished your snack, maybe a slice of eel, maybe a stubborn bit of fig that took longer to chew than you expected. And now you're full. Not uncomfortably so, but full in that medieval kind of way where your stomach is warm and your thoughts begin to slow. And that's when the dreams begin. Not the soft, abstract kind where you forget where you parked your horse. These are different, sharper, stranger. Tonight you dream of raisins. In the medieval mind, dreams were never just dreams. They were signs, messages, warnings. And when those dreams involved food, especially things as specific as fruit or bread, people paid attention. Because for medieval people, a vision of food while you slept might mean you were about to be blessed or cursed. This is the strange and symbolic world of dream foods, where everything from dried apples to bowls of barley porridge carried meanings deeper than flavor. To begin, let's establish our mainstream historical fact dream interpretation. In the Middle Ages wasn't just a superstition. It was a formal discipline, studied, written about, and practiced by clergy, physicians, and even royalty. Manuals like Somniala Danielis, a dream book widely circulated across Europe, offered detailed explanations of what different dreams meant. These texts were often organized alphabetically, like early encyclopedias, listing hundreds of common dreams and their associated outcomes. Dreams about food were especially common because eating and hunger were ever present in people's daily lives. So what did it mean to dream of eating? That depended on what exactly you were chewing in your sleep. Dreaming of raisins, for instance, might signal impending fortune sweetness after hardship. But dreaming of overripe or rotting fruit could mean disappointment, betrayal, or illness. Bread in a dream might mean abundance, but burnt bread loss. Dried figs were associated with lust over indulgence or hidden cravings, and meat that got complicated. Dreaming of roasted meat might suggest strength and victory, but raw meat decay, conflict, or in some interpretations an unresolved grievance. And it wasn't just about what you ate, but how. Eating slowly in a dream suggested patience and control. Eating quickly, especially if you couldn't stop, could mean you were being overwhelmed by temptation or fear. Sharing food meant harmony. Refusing food, rebellion. Medieval dream readers believed your sleeping behavior revealed your soul's state, and if food showed up, it meant your soul was hungry for something more. There's a fringe historical detail that's particularly fascinating. Some medieval physicians believed that dreams were directly shaped by what you ate before bed. Rich foods, especially meats and sweets, were thought to disturb the humors, producing vivid or chaotic dreams. One 15th century Italian doctor even recommended avoiding cheese before sleep, unless you wanted to see demons. Garlic, he claimed, could conjure false visions of women. Wine best avoided entirely if you wished to dream cleanly. These beliefs weren't just personal quirks. They were deeply woven into medical theory. According to humoral doctrine, digestion during sleep could create vapors, literal mists inside the body, that rose to the brain and triggered dreams. So if your food was heavy, spicy, or odd, your dreams would be too. This is why monks and priests often followed strict diets, not just for discipline, but to keep their dreams pure. A monk who dreamt of feasting might wake up anxious, wondering whether his soul had slipped. A nun who dreamt of cheese might spend the next day fasting in silence. In many monastic orders, dreams were confessed like sins. Historians still debate whether these dream books were taken literally or used more symbolically tools for reflection rather than prediction. Some suggest they functioned like medieval horoscopes, giving people a way to interpret their anxieties. Others argue that certain people, especially clergy, genuinely believed that dream foods could reveal divine or demonic messages. Picture this: you're asleep on a straw mattress. The fire's burned low. Your hands are still sticky from honey cake. And in your dream, you're back in the market, standing before a basket of plums. You reach for one. It's heavy, sweet-smelling. You take a bite and wake up in a sweat. What does it mean? In your dream book, you flip to plum. The entry reads, "To eat a plum in good health is to welcome a guest, but to eat it alone and fast, beware. A thief may come before the next moon." You lie back down trying to decide whether you're the host or the one being robbed. And it wasn't only lay people who sought meaning in midnight snacks. Kings, queens, and military leaders sometimes consulted dream interpreters before making big decisions. According to historical records, King Henry II once delayed a political move after dreaming of a banquet where he could not eat. The symbolism was debated for days. Did it mean defeat, famine, betrayal? No one knew for sure, but the march was postponed. There's even an account from 14th century France where a noblewoman reportedly dreamt of a pear falling from a tree and splitting in two. The next morning, she miscarried twins. Whether coincidence or confirmation bias, the story was repeated in multiple texts as evidence of food-based dreams predicting real-world loss. But not all food dreams were ominous. Some were blessings. Dreaming of bread baking in the sun, a good harvest. Dreaming of eating with your family. Harmony at home. Eating honeycomb in a dream was thought to bring spiritual insight. And dreaming of fruit trees heavy with figs and grapes. That was wealth. Or at the very least, the hope of better meals to come. Back in your own dream, you're seated at a table you've never seen before. The candles are floating somehow, and the bread is steaming even though no one's touched it. There are raisins scattered across the plate in neat little spirals. You reach for one, but your fingers pass through. You wake up. There's no raisin in your mouth, but you feel its sweetness lingering like something remembered too late. And you wonder not for the first time what it means. The dreams linger as the fire burns low images of figs bread raisins that vanish as you reach for them. But in medieval times, you wouldn't just shake it off and roll over. You'd wonder, was that a message? A prophecy? A warning from something greater than me? Welcome to the world of sleep temples where dreams were not private curiosities, but sacred gateways. In some corners of the medieval and ancient world, people believed the right dream under the right conditions could diagnose your illness, reveal your fate, or even heal you. And sometimes these dreams involved food. Let's begin with our mainstream historical fact. While medieval Europe itself didn't have formal sleep temples, the belief in divine messages through dreams was inherited from much older traditions, especially from the ancient Greek and Egyptian worlds. In particular, the practice of incubation, from Latin incubatio, was central to temple healing. Ailing visitors would sleep in designated sacred spaces, hoping to receive visions sent by gods such as Asclepius in Greece or Serapis and Imhotep in Egypt. These dreams were often interpreted by priests who acted like ancient therapists. Scribes and spiritual guides rolled into one. The connection to food. It was significant. Specific ritual meals like honey cakes, barley loaves, figs, dates, or even small pieces of roasted meat were often consumed before sleep. These weren't casual bedtime snacks. They were offerings, a way to commune with the divine. Sometimes the dreamer ate them. Other times they were burned or placed near the bed to appease or invite a sacred presence. What's fascinating is how this ancient tradition echoed into the Middle Ages, even if it wasn't called a sleep temple anymore. Christian monasteries began to function as spiritual retreats, where monks and pilgrims alike could fast, pray, and yes, dream. Some orders, like the Benedictines, meticulously recorded visions received in dreams, and interpreted them as signs of God's approval or displeasure. Many believed that dietary discipline enhanced the clarity of these visions. So while the temple complex of ancient Thebes may have vanished, the basic idea remained to eat to sleep, and to receive sacred knowledge through symbols, and often through the imagery of food. Now for a quirky historical tidbit, there's a 9th century Frankish account of a monk who during a severe illness dreamed he was offered a spoonful of honey by a glowing figure. Upon waking, he demanded honey, which according to the records marked the start of his recovery. This story was passed along as a minor miracle, not quite sainthood material, but memorable enough that jars of honey was sometimes placed near infirmary beds in case the Lord visited again. But food dreams weren't just divine messages, they could be tools for diagnosis. Medieval physicians, especially those trained under the influence of Galenic and Arabic medicine, often asked patients, "What did you dream about?" A dream of dry bread might indicate a cold imbalance. Spiced meat could suggest excessive heat in the liver. Too much fruit, moisture buildup, watch out for fevers. They believed the body in its illness tried to speak through images of nourishment, hunger, or rejection. Historians still debate just how much weight these dreams carried in formal diagnosis. Was it anecdotal, or actually treated as a diagnostic step? Some argue that dream interpretation was more of a supplement used when physical symptoms didn't explain a condition. Others believe that in monastic hospitals and more mystically inclined communities, dreams held near equal footing with pulse checks and urine analysis. Imagine it. You arrive at a monastery weak and pale. You've fasted for days. The monks give you warm water and a barley biscuit, nothing spiced, nothing rich. You sleep under rough wool surrounded by candlelight and chants. You dream of figs falling from the sky, splitting open like little suns. In the morning, you describe it to the scribe. He nods. The liver is strong, he writes. God has given favor. Continue light food and prayer. There's even speculation, though rarely confirmed in mainstream texts, that certain foods were prescribed not to heal the body directly, but to improve the quality of dreams. Nutmeg, for example, was believed to calm chaotic thoughts and make visions clearer. Fennel might ease digestive distress and allow for smoother sleep. And milk with honey. That was practically a medieval dream smoothie. Let's not forget the more mystical communities like the Cathars or the later German mystics, who believed that the soul could rise into other realms during sleep. These groups sometimes fasted not out of bodily need, but to lighten the soul, making it easier for visions to break through. In these dreams, bread and wine weren't just symbols of Christ, they were doorways. To eat them in a dream might signal divine invitation, or a warning that the dreamer had grown too comfortable with worldly pleasures. And if this all seems far away from our discussion of medieval junk food, consider this every time a person consumes something rich, strange, or outside their usual diet, they risked a visit from the subconscious. Spiced cakes, rare fruits, or too much meat at a feast could all lead to nighttime visions. These weren't just indigestion, they were believed to be communications. There's even an amusing tale from a 13th century English abbey in which a novice ate too much roasted duck at a festival and dreamed he was chased by talking loaves of bread wearing crowns. When he confessed this to his abbot, he was given mint water and told to pray for humility. The record notes that he abstained from rich foods for 3 moons. So when medieval people lay down at night full from trench toast or a sneaky cheese curd, they didn't simply close their eyes. They opened a door, one that might reveal their spiritual health, predict their future, or give them a glimpse, however fleeting, of the divine. In modern times, it might feel silly to worry whether your dream of eating raisins in the rain means you're about to receive an inheritance. But back then, it was serious. It shaped decisions, inspired fasts, guided kings. And it all started with a full belly, a flickering candle, and a dream. You turn over, clutching your wool blanket tighter. In your dream, you're offered a honey cake on a silver plate. You hesitate. Something about it feels important. But as you reach out, the candle blows out and everything fades. What does it mean you might need a monk? Or a spoonful of honey? Or just another hour of sleep? You sleep through the night, but the visions don't stop. In the distance, a loaf of bread cracks open like a blooming flower. A pot of stew stirs itself. A hand you can't see offers you a piece of dried fruit and whispers something in Latin. You don't remember what it said. You only remember the taste burnt sugar and something like smoke. In medieval thought, this wasn't nonsense. This was divine indigestion messages, carried by food smoke dreams and even your bellyache. Let's sit with that phrase for a moment. Divine indigestion. Sounds ridiculous, doesn't it? But for many people in the Middle Ages and the civilizations that influenced them, it wasn't a joke. If a dream could be prophetic, then so could the meal that caused it. Not every vision needed a choir of angels. Sometimes it only took too much spiced wine and an overcooked meat pie. Let's begin with the mainstream historical fact. In ancient Jewish and Christian traditions, dreams were often vehicles for God's messages, and food frequently played a symbolic role. Consider the story of Pharaoh's dream in Genesis, where 7 fat cows and 7 skinny cows represent feast and famine. Or Ezekiel's vision of eating a scroll that tasted as sweet as honey, a metaphor for receiving divine words. These stories shaped medieval interpretations. Religious scholars, especially monastic ones, took these symbols seriously. If food appeared in a dream, it was rarely dismissed as just a craving. It meant something. Now zoom forward a few centuries. Picture a 12th century Benedictine monk, pale and weary from fasting. He dreams of breaking bread with a radiant figure dressed in fire-colored robes. The next morning he writes it down and brings it to the abbey's dream reader, a kind of early therapist-priest hybrid, who determines that the bread signifies a coming revelation, and the fire robes, holy transformation. Later that week, the monk claims to receive divine inspiration during prayer. Coincidence, maybe. Or maybe he just needed carbs. Here's a quirky historical tidbit. In some Slavic Christian communities during the late Middle Ages, it was believed that if a person dreamed of cooking or baking bread, it meant a major family decision was approaching. But if they burned the bread in the dream, bad omen. Someone in the household might fall ill. This wasn't just folklore, it found its way into household prayer guides and dream manuals, which circulated widely among literate households. The logic behind these connections was often rooted in humoral medicine, that charming medieval system where your health depended on the balance of 4 bodily fluids: blood phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. These fluids governed your mood, digestion, even the flavor of your dreams. If you dreamed of bitter herbs or sour wine, a physician might say your black bile was overpowering, suggesting melancholy or spiritual dryness. Too much meat in a dream, a sign of blood excess, passion risk, even violence. And the practice of interpreting these dreams, that wasn't confined to monasteries. Historians still argue whether lay people took these symbols as seriously as monks did. Some evidence suggests educated townspeople kept dream books, consulted clergy, or shared strange dreams with friends during morning bread baking. Others think the serious decoding was more limited to cloisters and court physicians. The truth likely is a messy mix, just like a medieval stew. But beyond individual dreams, there were collective interpretations. Imagine a village priest rising to speak during Mass, warning the congregation that several members had dreamed of spoiled wine and rotting meat. These are signs, he might say, of spiritual decay among us. The community might then fast for a week, donate dried goods to the poor, or hold a night vigil. Whether or not the dreams had culinary origins, they had very real consequences. And what of the food itself? Offerings were part of the ritual. Burnt bread, blackened cakes, or bowls of spiced porridge were sometimes left near altars or thresholds as protection. In Nordic and Baltic Christianized traditions, these acts retained a pagan flavor food as shield food, as signal. Offer a barley cake to God, and ask for clarity in return. Interestingly, not all sacred snacks were meant for the divine alone. Sometimes they were shared. Consider the Eastern Orthodox practice of prosphora, a bread baked with sacred symbols and divided during communion, or the Jewish Sabbath bread challah, braided with care and set aside as both sustenance and spiritual symbol. The line between eating and believing, between taste and meaning, blurred until they became inseparable. In medieval Spain, mystics like Teresa of Avila and John of the Cross wrote of ecstatic visions involving feasts, heavenly banquets filled with honey and oil and wine. While these were metaphorical, the food imagery was not random. It drew from the biblical tradition and resonated deeply with people who lived in a world where food was rarely abundant. To dream of a feast wasn't just spiritual, it was a visceral symbol of hope, abundance, and the divine. And let's not forget the unsettling side. A burnt offering might signal judgment, a spoiled fig impurity. One 15th century manuscript from a German convent records a nun's recurring dream of choking on a raisin. After confession and fasting, she reported the dream vanished, leading her sisters to conclude that the raisin had symbolized a hidden pride, sweet and small but deadly when swallowed unexamined. These were not people dreaming of candy bars and potato chips. These were men and women whose concept of indulgence was a slice of fresh pear or a bite of hot bread. To them, food wasn't just sustenance. It was symbol. It was signal. It was a whisper from heaven, or a warning from the other side. And for those who dared to question whether indigestion or divine intervention was responsible, there was always the fallback fasting. If your dreams were confusing, your thoughts cloudy, or your stomach unsettled, abstinence was often the answer. Clear your body to clear your spirit. Then try dreaming again. You pull your blanket closer. Somewhere in your memory, someone is offering you a bowl of pottage. It's steaming. You're hungry. You reach, but the bowl turns to stone. You wake up unsure what that meant, but certain of one thing: the bread you left by the candle is gone. Maybe a mouse took it, or maybe something else is listening. You dream of a feast, but it's not yours. Gold platters, steaming bowls, and sweet breads rise like clouds across a marble table. Then a whisper: "Eat, and you shall rule." You reach, but the food vanishes. In its place, a crown made of dough. Welcome to the peculiar world of prophetic pastries, where snacks weren't just sustenance, but symbols of future power doom or divine calling. In the medieval world, dreams were never just background noise. They were part of daily decision-making, royal succession, and even spiritual warfare. Monarchs consulted dream interpreters before going to war. Monks fasted for clarity. Peasants whispered their visions over garden fences. And more often than you'd expect, these dreams involved food. Let's begin with a mainstream historical fact. In the 12th century, English historian William of Malmesbury recorded a dream about King Henry I. The king, dreaming before a key political decision, envisioned a table covered in roasted birds, each representing a noble house. Some flew away, others burned. Interpreters claimed the vision foretold rebellion and shifting alliances. And they were right. The following year, several earls turned against the king. Whether coincidence or confirmation bias, the food on that dream table became political prophecy. Royal courts across Europe took dreams very seriously, and food appeared often. A queen dreaming of golden apples might be advised to expect a child. A duke who dreamt of spoiled wine might cancel a trip suspecting betrayal. These weren't just fairy tales. Records from Castilian, Hungarian, and Carpathian courts show detailed interpretations of such symbols. Dream omens were treated like weather forecasts, unreliable but too important to ignore. But why food more than any other object straddled the line between body and soul? You consumed it, you craved it, you depended on it, but it also held symbolism. Bread meant life. Wine meant blood and joy and sacrifice. Fruit suggested fertility. Meat could imply wealth or danger. If you saw a pie in your dream, someone would ask, what's hidden inside a quirky historical tidbit? In 14th century Venice, it was said that if a baker dreamt of burning a batch of honey tarts, it meant a wedding in the family followed by scandal. If the tarts came out golden and perfect, the dreamer could expect prosperity. Bakeries across the city were quietly considered places of symbolic sensitivity. And some bakers began noting down their dreams, treating them like financial forecasts. But it wasn't just baked goods. In Bohemian chronicles, one noblewoman reportedly dreamed of being served a raw eel coiled around her plate. She interpreted it as a warning of betrayal by someone close, and indeed her cousin was found conspiring to seize her estate. And this brings us to a persistent scholarly debate. Were these food dreams actually believed, or were they post hoc interpretations used to justify decisions? Some argue that medieval people earnestly believed food visions carried divine weight. Others suggest rulers used these tales as narrative tools to legitimize actions, inspire fear, or explain failures. Perhaps both are true. People often believe what helps them sleep at night, or what helps others follow them into battle. Let's leave the royal halls and slip into a monastery where dreams and food held quieter, but no less powerful meanings. In the 13th century, a nun named Hildegard of Bingen, later canonized as a saint, wrote extensively on visions involving symbolic foods. In one account, she saw a glowing loaf of bread suspended over a river, which she interpreted as divine nourishment for those crossing through spiritual hardship. Her writing, steeped in metaphysical language, became popular among both mystics and physicians, and in later centuries, her ideas influenced dream interpreters across Europe. What's remarkable is that many of these visions were tied not to gluttony or indulgence, but to purpose. A dream of cake didn't mean you needed dessert. It meant you needed clarity. A vision of milk might point to innocence healing or divine reassurance. A feast could signal abundance, but also temptation or distraction. The most famous of these prophetic food dreams may come from Joan of Arc. Though not usually discussed in terms of cuisine, one of her earliest visions reportedly involved being offered a simple piece of bread by a radiant figure. Scholars still debate whether this detail was symbolic or practical, an echo of Eucharistic tradition, or just an artifact of hunger. Regardless, the moment was profound enough for her to mention it in trial transcripts. And beyond individual dreams, entire political movements were occasionally sparked by edible omens. In 15th century Germany, a preacher claimed to receive a vision from God during Lent, a great wooden bowl filled with worms and wheat. The bowl, he said, represented the church tainted by corruption, yet still nourishing the people. His sermon went viral, so to speak. The image appeared in woodcuts, pamphlets, even murals. And while church authorities condemned him, the people remembered the bowl. Food dreams weren't just symbols. They were mobilizers. Easy to understand, hard to argue with. Who can contest a vision of rotting bread when everyone in the village just spent a winter chewing moldy crusts? But let's not forget the stranger side. In 14th century Norway, a fisherman reported dreaming of a roast chicken with 2 heads. According to his local priest, this foretold division in the kingdom. A week later, news arrived that 2 heirs to the throne had declared rival claims. Coincidence, perhaps. But the priest's prediction elevated the dream from nonsense to national omen. The fisherman was briefly treated as a prophet and served as dream witness during a political negotiation. Sometimes dreams involving food even led to legal testimony. In 1421, an English servant claimed she had seen her mistress poisoned in a dream. In the vision, the woman was eating a pie that turned black. When the mistress died weeks later, reportedly after eating meat pie, the servant's testimony was considered evidence of divine intervention, enough to trigger a local investigation. Whether the dream was real or invented, it mattered because it was believed. It's tempting to chuckle. Dreams of food, really. But when you think about it, what else do you dream of when your days are filled with hunger, repetition, and hardship? For many, food was more than fuel. It was hope. When the outside world offered little pleasure, the inside world, your dreams, became the last banquet table. And this doesn't end in the Middle Ages. The tradition of prophetic food symbolism survived through folk tales, dream books, and kitchen superstitions. Even today, old rural families across parts of Europe and Central Asia keep dream journals where food plays a starring role. Dreaming of sweet apples, expect a surprise visitor. Spilling soup in a dream, family argument ahead, bread sliced unevenly, a friend's loyalty may be tested. In the early modern period, as psychology emerged and dreams became medicalized, food retained its symbolic power. Freud's theory of latent content often involved food as sexual or familial symbols, cake as temptation milk, as maternal care, meat as aggression. But let's not get too Freudian. In the medieval mind, a dream of cherries simply meant summer was coming. And maybe, if you were lucky, love. As you drift deeper into sleep, you feel something cool and soft placed in your hand. A pear, ripe and glistening. The room smells of warm spices. You hear laughter in a language you don't understand. You bite, and suddenly you're sitting at a table where every seat is filled with a version of you, older, younger, sadder, wiser. They all chew in silence. And in that moment, you understand something strange and wonderful. You aren't just dreaming of food. You're dreaming of yourself. You find yourself walking through a silent village at twilight. The cottages are tucked into the hills like sleeping dogs, their chimneys breathing out the last warmth of the day. A flicker of candlelight spills from a narrow window, and inside you see a family gathered around something small and precious. Not a relic, not a coin, not a piece of parchment, but a bowl. Just a simple bowl filled with fruit and honey. No one speaks. The mother breaks a fig in half. The daughter offers a raisin to the grandfather. In this moment, you realize you're watching a ceremony, and its name is farewell. This is where we are now, at the soft boundary between life and death, the realm where snacks surprisingly still matter. In medieval times, food didn't just nourish the living, it also followed the dead. In this section, we explore how treats, drinks, and humble offerings were carried into the afterlife, both literally and symbolically. Let's start with the mainstream historical fact, backed by solid archaeological evidence in burials across medieval Europe. Especially from the 9th to 14th centuries, graves often contained food items. According to Professor Roberta Gilchrist, a leading medieval archaeologist from the University of Reading, food was part of the emotional toolkit of burial. It connected the living to the dead through memory ritual and shared culture. From honey cakes to nuts, dried fruit, wine, and bread offerings were commonly found near the head or chest of the deceased, suggesting they were not just symbolic, but personally meaningful. These were not elaborate banquets. Most graves didn't feature gold chalices or rich pastries. Instead, they held tokens, crumbs of comfort, meant to soothe the journey ahead. A wedge of cheese, a piece of flatbread wrapped in cloth. In some cases, carefully sealed jars of ale or spiced wine were buried beside the body. Not for show, for continuity. And this practice wasn't just confined to Europe. Across the Christian East, particularly in Byzantine territories, foods like koliva, a dish of boiled wheat mixed with honey and raisins, were both funeral meal and burial gift. Still today, this dish is served at memorial services in Orthodox traditions. It's a culinary echo of medieval mourning, carried forward like a soft refrain. But let's go deeper. If food was the bridge between the living and the divine, then graves were kitchens of memory. And these memories weren't always solemn. In Saxon England, one family buried a man with a pouch of smoked meats, pork probably. Perhaps he was a butcher, or simply loved his bacon. In 10th century Ireland, one grave held a bundle of foraged nuts wrapped in linen. A child's grave in southern France revealed the presence of wild honeycomb. These aren't grand gestures. They're love notes scribbled in ingredients. Meanwhile, written records from monastic chronicles describe elaborate funeral feasts where guests brought food the deceased enjoyed. Afterward, leftover items, sometimes still warm, were placed in the grave. One monk in a 12th century Norman text wrote, "He loved cherries and black bread. So I laid them in a clay dish upon his chest, for surely the Lord would let him taste one more bite." A quirky historical tidbit. In medieval Bohemia, there was a custom of placing salted pancakes on the eyelids of the dead, believed to feed the soul's vision on its path to heaven. The symbolism isn't fully explained in surviving texts, but scholars suspect it was linked to the idea that sweet and savory foods reflected the balance of justice and mercy in divine judgment. Now let's address an open scholarly debate. Did these offerings reflect genuine belief in physical consumption after death? Or were they metaphorical gestures of grief and affection? Some historians argue that these snacks were never meant to be eaten by the deceased, but served instead as sacrificial comfort food nourishment for the family's emotions. Others point to folk beliefs and oral traditions, suggesting a liminal period after death, where spirits might linger, watching, hungering, even tasting. In these accounts, food helped anchor the soul, easing its passage through the in-between. In Slavic folklore, for instance, a meal called the pominki was served for the dead on the 9th and 40th days after death. Plates were laid for the deceased, and food was not cleared until dawn. Sometimes bites were even left on the threshold. In Germanic lands, bread and milk were poured into grave holes during burial, while in rural France, honey cakes were burned beside the grave, smoke rising as a kind of culinary incense. But the most poignant form of edible remembrance came through dream offerings. Many grieving families in medieval times reported dreaming of their loved ones, asking for specific foods. These dreams often led to acts of fulfillment. A mother might bake the cake her son appeared requesting in a dream. A widower might leave mead on the grave after dreaming of a thirsty wife. Church records include petitions for clergy to bless such offerings, treating them as part of the mourning process, while modern science might chalk it up to grief psychology. Medieval minds saw this as communication, not metaphor, message. Let's wander now into a graveyard. Picture a cemetery on a foggy hill in Yorkshire. It's the 14th century. A family is gathered with a clay pitcher of ale, some oatcakes, and a tiny fig. They set these down beside a newly dug grave. A small fire burns. A hymn is sung. The food is left behind not as waste, but as a whispered hope. May this feed you where we cannot follow. But not all foods were created equal. Some were thought to be gate openers items that helped the dead transition faster or more smoothly. Dried fruit, especially raisins and figs, held symbolic weight. Wine was both a cleanser and a communicator believed to carry thoughts and intentions across realms. Honey rich and golden symbolized eternal life. Bread was of course sacred, sometimes marked with crosses or tears. In regions of Spain and southern Italy, families would bake special soul cakes, small sweet rolls, stamped with the initials of the deceased. These were either left on graves given to the poor in the name of the dead to buy prayers, or eaten during the funeral with a moment of silence. This practice influenced the later All Souls' Day traditions in the Catholic calendar, and is echoed today in Halloween's dim memory of souling. In Armenia, a dish called kashil, a wheat porridge, sweetened with syrup, was traditionally made during funerals, and shared with both the living and the spirit of the departed. Similar customs exist across Georgia, Syria, and the Balkans, suggesting a wide cultural belief that eating together bridged realms. Interestingly, even church doctrine evolved around these practices. Some early church fathers, while wary of pagan associations, tolerated or even blessed food offerings, as long as they were redirected through prayer. Others condemned the idea, outright labeling it as superstition. Still, the people persisted. What these traditions reveal is that medieval people didn't just mourn the dead, they fed them. With figs and flatbreads, with raisins and mead, they said, "You mattered. You still matter. And we hope somehow this food finds you." And sometimes they hoped the food might help carry a message back. There are records of people whispering secrets to cakes, or writing messages on bread crusts with wine before burying them. One account from 13th century Provence describes a woman pressing a token into a honey cake before laying it at her husband's grave. The token read simply, "Tell our son I forgive him." Was it desperation theater or faith? Perhaps all three. And if you're wondering whether this was just a rural phenomenon, no. Royalty did it too. King Edward the Confessor of England was buried with a loaf of sacramental bread in his hands. Queen Matilda of Flanders was laid to rest with honeyed plums. Emperor Frederick II of the Holy Roman Empire was buried with spiced wine and figs as per his own request. These weren't bribes for the afterlife. They were reminders of life's sweetness, tasted, treasured, and finally surrendered. In some tombs, jars of preserved fruits, apricots, cherries, mulberries have been discovered still sealed. The contents decayed, but the intent clear. These were not indulgences. They were blessings tucked between prayers and bones. And so we return to the present. When you think of medieval junk food, those fritters pies, dried fruits, sticky cakes, it's easy to see them as curiosities, strange snacks from a distant world. But in truth, they were part of a much larger story, a story of connection, between hunger and hope, between body and spirit, between life and death. And perhaps that's the most beautiful truth, even in the darkest of centuries, even in the poorest of homes, even in the coldest of winters, people still made time to sweeten the goodbye. So next time you taste a fig, or press your thumb into warm dough, remember someone long ago did the same thing. Not for themselves, but for someone they loved, Someone sleeping under stone. Someone waiting maybe for one last bite. It begins with crumbs. A few grains of barley dust scattered across the wooden floor. A sliver of candied root clinging to a rough linen sleeve. A whisper of scent fennel smoke. Maybe something sweet hanging in the candlelit air. It's late now, the fire is low, and the halls are silent, but for the occasional creak of beams above. And yet someone somewhere is still chewing. The medieval midnight snack, you see, wasn't just an indulgence. It was an act of comfort, a survival tactic, a small, quiet rebellion against the cold, the hunger and the weight of days that stretched too long. And for many people, peasants, monks, nobles alike, these stolen bites were among the few things they could call their own. In monasteries across Europe, the rule of St. Benedict prescribed strict fasting hours. But even within these spiritual boundaries, monks sometimes found ways to slip a dried fig from a personal stash, or sip from a hidden wineskin before dawn. Not always with guilt, sometimes simply with gratitude. Food, after all, was both earthly and sacred. Eating it even alone in the dark was a kind of prayer. For the poor, especially in winter, these nighttime snacks were more about necessity than ritual. A leftover crust softened in broth. A spoon of fermented porridge scraped from the bottom of the pot. Nothing went to waste, especially not when sleep was light and stomachs were emptier still. Children would wake from cold dreams and press close to their mother's chest, hoping for warmth and maybe a bite of something soft. These moments were quiet, unrecorded, but deeply human. And for those who could afford a bit more midnight, in a medieval castle, might bring out trays of spiced wine bowls of dried fruits, even bits of meat from the earlier feast. Servants would sneak mouthfuls between duties. Lords might wander wrapped in wool, following their nose to the kitchen hearth, where something still simmered. There was always something simmering. The practice of late-night snacking wasn't formalized, but it was widespread. Medieval cookbooks don't record midnight snack recipes, but they don't need to. The scraps tell the story. Historians studying kitchen refuse in French chateaux and German monasteries have found peculiar distributions of bone fragments, fruit peels and charred bread bits in nighttime refuse piles. It's the archaeological equivalent of a glowing fridge light. The need for food in the late hours also birthed a kind of mini-economy. In bustling towns, bakers would rise before dawn to start the next day's loaves. And sometimes night walkers and guards could purchase still warm buns or leftover pasties for a few coins. Street food didn't sleep. One mainstream historical fact comes from 14th century London, where a set of ordinances regulating bakeries noted complaints of bread stolen or sold beneath price after sundown. While framed as theft or fraud, scholars now believe, this was also a window into the nighttime food culture, bakers bartering cheap end-of-day loaves to the hungry, the drunk, or the working poor. Not legal, but profoundly human. Of course, some snacks carried a touch of superstition. It was said in some Welsh villages that eating cheese or honey cakes after midnight invited strange dreams. In Bohemia, garlic eaten late would ward off sleep spirits. In Italy, stale wine-dunked bread called pan mole was believed to settle the stomach and the soul. And then there were the lovers. Medieval literature is filled with scenes of secret rendezvous over shared morsels. A knight sneaking back to his lady's chamber with a pear pilfered from the kitchen. A noblewoman sharing candied almonds with a troubadour under moonlight. In these quiet hours, food was affection. An edible gesture, a promise. Even religious festivals created openings for late-night feasting. During certain vigils or night masses, food stalls near churches would offer quick sustenance for attendees. Pilgrims and parishioners could grab a handful of nuts, a warm roll, or a sip of spiced ale to carry them through the night. One quirky tidbit in a 15th century English manor inventory, a night box, was listed among the pantry contents. Its contents: honeyed fruits, wafers, and pickled root. No instructions, no timing, just a quiet label for a small comfort stash. As the Middle Ages waned and early modern habits took shape, the idea of late-night food became more structured. In France, the souper emerged a post-evening meal snack, sometimes shared socially, other times taken in solitude. It marked a shift in how people thought about eating, not just when you were hungry, but when the mood called. But the spirit of medieval midnight bites remains. In every bite of leftover cake eaten by candlelight, every cold slice of meat straight from the pot, every warm sip in the hush of a dark kitchen, we echo those long-gone souls who simply needed a moment of flavor before surrendering to sleep. So now, as your eyes grow heavy and your breath slows, picture them. The baker's child sneaking figs in the attic, the monk smiling over his hidden cheese, the peasant pressing warm mash into a child's waiting hands. Picture yourself among them, sharing something simple and good wrapped in the quiet of the night. And if you happen to dream of honey cakes tonight, smile. Somewhere in the dust of history, someone else did too. As the final crumbs settle and the candle burns low, you find yourself drifting, not just into sleep, but into the lingering warmth of 1,000 quiet kitchens, echoing with the crackle of embers and the hush of late-night footsteps. The world behind your eyelids is softer now, simpler. A place where time moves slowly and flavors carry memory more than urgency. Let your breath ease just like the bread dough left to rise on a chilly windowsill. Let your thoughts stretch gently like melted honey curling through hot wine. You've walked through taverns, wandered castle corridors, peeked into monastery pantries, and warmed your hands beside the hearths of people long gone, but somehow familiar. Because across centuries, hunger has always found a whisper in the night, a need not just for food, but for reassurance. A bite that says you made it through the day, a sip that says rest now, you're safe. Even now, in a world of fast food and glowing screens, we reach for the same thing. They did something sweet, something warm, something small enough to hold in one hand, and just enough to carry us into sleep. So tonight, as the wind brushes gently past your window, imagine the comforting weight of a honey cake in your palm, the scent of ale-drenched toast rising from a clay bowl, or the cool crunch of a stolen pear beneath the stars. Let that memory not be someone else's history, but your own just softly retold. You are full now, not just with facts and flavors, but with the kind of peace that only quiet stories can bring. So close your eyes, breathe in, and drift away, knowing that even in the darkest hours, the smallest comforts still find a way to shine.